I'm John Pryor. Good to see everyone here today. Today we're going to be talking about SMA's approach to strategy. We call it making winning choices. I'm going to walk you through one of our presentations that we give with our clients to give you a sense of how we interact with clients when we present strategy to them, so that you can get an idea of how we think about it. So first of all, strategy, not unknown to everybody, but I always like to tell clients strategy is very much like tofu. Sort of means everything to everyone, and as a result, it means nothing to just about everybody. Every company has its own approach to strategy. Everybody talks about strategy. This happens to be our particular approach. I think, Lexi, you can go to the next slide. Let's start by talking about why we felt like we needed to have our own unique approach to strategy and how we think about strategy. So for a lot of companies, strategy starts with that data piece. Everybody has it, and they all understand that you ended up with a couple of choices, and then ultimately management picks a choice. But it's that black box that really sits at the center. That's the gap for a lot of companies. Black box is filled by a lot of things. Sometimes it's a Delphic model, a single person kind of comes up with a strategy. You'll see that a lot, particularly on win strategy or capture strategy. Go back to the last person who won something and ask them what they did and have them come up with a strategy. Oftentimes, it's a small group of people that come up with this strategy. Regardless of whether it's experiential based or whether it's a single person or whether it's a small group of people, without really being able to have everyone kick the tires on it, understand how we got there, what the assumptions were, why we came to those assumptions, and what the underlying analysis is, you end up with this position where nobody really knows why we got here, and how we can really act against it. The challenge with that is that it creates those 5 bullets on the right-hand side of the slide. So first and foremost, oftentimes the choices aren't compelling. So somebody landed on a set of strategy choices, but it's not really entirely clear why they landed up there. And they're often vulnerable. Sometimes choices don't get made. So there's a whole bunch of issues that are out there, questions that people have, but because other functions weren't represented, because it was heavily weighted towards one side of the organization or another, some decisions may not get made because we're not having all the right people in the room. Worse, choices get made, but then they fall apart. So this oftentimes ends up being a consensus type problem. So you either think you have everyone agreeing on the solution and how we're going to go forward, or there's weak consensus, but in reality, nobody's really bought into the how, the why, and the where we're going with this. The not making timely choices. People understand the strategy, but nobody's really built out the execution and the implementation of that strategy. And so as a result, the whole buy-in process either didn't take place or has to be done after the strategy has been developed. And then the last one is around a lack of robustness. So ultimately, what this means is that strategy, it's all kinds of military adages, 90% strategy, 10% executed, obviously worse than a 20% strategy, 80% executed. There's all kinds of ways that people frame this. But ultimately, what you need is the right people in the room to have the right set of conversations so that buy-in is made early and that you create a strategy that is actionable. A strategy that is divorced from the rest of the organization is not going to help anybody, and it certainly won't advance the organization forward. So what did SMA, how did we think about this problem? Advance, Lexi? So this is SMA's approach. SMA views this as a comprehensive, iterative approach to strategy that does a couple of things. So first of all, as I said, you want to bring in everyone from across functions. So program management, execution, technical, business systems. Everybody needs to be in the room because everybody has a different point of view and everybody has a different piece to play in the strategy. The idea is to bring everyone together so that everyone is executing against something that they can understand, get behind, and achieve. That leads to that second point, which is translating strategy to action. Oftentimes people view strategy or strategists as this ivory tower or standalone type of capability, but the reality is they shouldn't be, and they aren't. Well-developed strategy builds action planning into it from day one. It takes into account who's going to execute and how it's going to be executed all the way at the end. If it's not considering that, then you've got a problem all the way at the beginning. That fourth bullet around explicitly detailing the logic and letting the team revisit new information is particularly important. There's two pieces to that. The first part is around the iteration. So as new information comes in, people should be able to retest assumptions. People should be able to retest elements of the strategy to make sure it's durable against the new information. But I think the more important piece is around the set of assumptions. Everyone walks into any decision that they make, no matter if it's your personal life or your professional life, with a whole set of implicit biases and implicit assumptions. There's nothing wrong with that. We're all fed by our own experiences, good and bad. We're fed by the different types of companies that we've worked for, the different roles that we've had, and that's actually part of what makes it a really powerful. Where the risk comes in is if I make a recommendation or I come to a conclusion based off a set of assumptions, and you come to the same conclusion, but you're working with a different set of assumptions, we might find ourselves diverging quite quickly. So you can imagine a set of assumptions where I've made some assumptions around a customer, but you've made assumptions around some sort of supply chain issues. We might both be working towards the same North Star, but I might be slightly northwest and you might be slightly northeast as we're trying to work down those paths, and we might find ourselves diverging on the actual execution. So by getting everyone's assumptions clearly and cleanly on the table so that we're crisply understanding how and why I got to my recommendations or my thinking allows us to one, increase buy-in and more quickly, but two, allows us to forestall any types of issues that might come up as we move forward. Next slide, Lexi. Thanks so much. At the heart of this is what we call reverse engineering. So on the previous slide, you saw those the various steps. So the 9-step process broadly works into three pieces. Frame and understand the challenge. So you come up with all the different types of choices you have. Oftentimes, companies don't they skip past that, don't come up with multiple choices. They really have already landed on something. Step 2 is pressure test those choices. And then step 3 is select and implement those choices. But at the pressure testing, the real heart of our approach is this concept that we call reverse engineering. So reverse engineering, simply put, as it shows on the right-hand side of the slide, just means start with the end in mind and work your way backward from there to figure out what must be true for a given strategy to manifest. So why do we do that as an approach? There's a couple of reasons. So what we find is that when people build strategy bottom up, a number of things happen. So first of all, they're trying to build a ladder towards a strategy that they're achieving. You'll end up hearing things like, "We're going to get some quick wins," and so they tend to focus on areas that they're already good at. They're an engineering company. They'll focus on engineering and say, once we get some quick wins here, then we can start to deal with the other functions and the other challenges that are there. What ends up happening though is they often never get to the other pieces, or they miss what the other pieces might be, and they build a rickety strategy that's not really durable because it's focused on things that they're already good at. When you think about reverse engineering, you move backward and say, look, there's 10,000 things I'm going to have to do to implement any given strategy that I choose. The real question is, what are the most important things I need to deal with, and when do I need to deal with them? And so by doing a reverse engineering, you divorce yourself necessarily from that bottom-up quick win idea to say, what are the most essential assumptions that I have to clear? What are the most essential facts that I need to prove now to be able to move forward to the next stage? So the idea is that you identify what those critical events are, and then you knock, and then you can move on to the next set of critical actions or critical tasks. So an example I like to give, if you think about, well, I want to go do manufacturing of soda in a country overseas. And you say, okay, well, what are all the things I need to do to set up a factory and train a workforce and move forward? How am I going to go about doing all of that? Like, those are all noble questions, and they're all actions that you may need to take. But if you reverse engineer it, it ends up that before you can do anything in that country that you've selected, you have to have a joint venture, because it has to be at least 51% owned by a local entity. And if you have a legal rule in your company that says, I'm not going to set up a joint venture where we're not the majority shareholder, then you're going to find that that strategy is going to fail straight away. So the question is, what do you need to work on first? Got to go to legal to see why we have that, to see if it's a viable strategy, to see if we can change it. It's a simple example that sort of pre-stalls where people from working on all the things that are important and helpful, figuring out factory space and all of that, to really focusing on the most essential types of tasks. So how do we actually go about doing that? Lexi, if you can go to the next slide. So we typically facilitate these activities with clients over a day. Depends on the size of the problem. Can be done in a half day or a day or even a couple of days, depending on the number of issues that are at play. But ultimately, we structure it in this way. On the right-hand side is the strategy or the option that we're going to explore, and then you work your way backward to figure out what has to be true along each of these dimensions. The boxes themselves, where it says predictions, enterprise strategy, customer, those change and they're variable depending on the complexity of the problem. But ultimately, they fall into four primary buckets. The first is what has to be true for our competitors. How are they thinking about this same kind of problem? Particularly helpful in government contracting, the type of work that we do with the Department of Defense and within the rest of the federal government. Who are the competitors? How are they thinking about it? They're moving around us and they're trying to shape the customer at the same time that we're trying to shape them. After you've looked at your competitive set, then you're looking at yourself. What are the various things that I have? What's my strategy? What's my broader strategy? How does this activity fit in with that strategy? Is this approachable? Once you start to look at specific types of programs, what's my technical offering, my program approach, risk, pricing, all of those types of pieces that you're going to really want to understand what has to be true for me to be able to execute against this strategy. Looking at it from a customer standpoint, so what has to be true for the customer to be able to get what they actually want. And so when the customer is trying to meet its needs is what we have going to achieve that. So what has to be true for adjusting how the customer thinks about the problem to move more into our approach or to think about it with other people. And then finally, who are the other players that are involved? There's always other types of players that have an influence to it. The question is, what has to be true for others that might be either for or against us, and how might we have to act with that? So in our industry, from aerospace and defense and government standpoint, obvious actors are other services that might be involved, as well as Congress. So if you're thinking about it, walking down a line from a shipbuilding plan, what type of program and how will it be pursued by competitors, but also what other players might be out there that might tip the scale in their favor. So once we've identified all of those conditions, and we have these where it can be dozens, but we've also done these over multi-day ones where there are literally hundreds of conditions. And now you've gotten back to the point where there's so much there, how do you actually consume and figure out what is most important and where should I be focusing a team on? It doesn't matter if it's a capture strategy team. It doesn't matter if it's a sector or division strategy, pre-specific opportunity. The question is, how do I focus everybody on the most essential aspects? So we'll talk about that next. Lexi, if you could go to the next slide, please. So what we do is we score the conditions. 3 variables to score them. First of all, how important is that condition? Again, it gets back to this question of, there's things that are relatively more or less important. Part of this discussion when we do this is to crowdsource these so that you force people to make decisions. It's too easy to say everything is important or everything is most important. So then you force people to do relative scoring to say, okay, well, which would you do before, which is more important than the others. The second one, which is around certainty, which is how likely do I believe that condition, that what has to be true, will manifest on its own without someone intervening. And then the last one is around control, which is how much ability do I have to influence how that condition might develop. Control actually ends up being where we spend a lot of our time. At one end, you have things like your competitors. You have zero control on what your competitors do. They can make whatever choices they want, absent of anything that you're doing. and you just have to be responsive to it or be prepared to manage it. The next level up are areas where you have influence, but not necessarily direct control. These are things around your customers, things around Congress, areas where you have some ability to influence them. You can write white papers, you can engage with them, you can push them to make some decisions, but ultimately they're going to make decisions based off the input you and others are giving them. The more complex problem, though, for control ends up being in organizations. At one level, if you say my company has control over this, that sounds great. But the reality is that the level of control within an organization varies based off of the type of strategy problem that you have and based off of the complexity of the problem that you're looking at. What we frequently face people who are in the win strategy or capture strategy phase, where the three levels of control might be the capture team or the itself, where they have budget, they have people, they have activities, and they have full control. They can put more against engineering resources. They can send out more business development people to speak to customers. But above them tends to be sector, which has to be able to give them additional resources. And above that tends to be the corporate interests. So it ends up that there might be a condition that is highly important that the capture team needs help with. Say, as an example, go talk to the Secretary of the Army about something. But it ends up it's not the capture team or even sector that can do that. It's being prioritized at the corporate level, where corporate says this is actually priority number 5 for us. So even though there's potentially a high level of control at the company level, in reality, it's not going to occur because it's not at the highest level of interest for the enterprise itself. So how do we put this where I can make sense of this data that we have? Lexi, if you can go to the next slide, please. So what we do is we end up mapping these things. And why don't you go to the next slide to bring it all together. When you map these things, all those things that are in the top top left box, whether they're in that red or that yellow, those tend to be high importance, things that have low certainty, but are really going to impact where you're at. We're going to talk about that in just a second. Everything that's below the line, that dotted line, those tend to be your low priority activities. You can outsource those or not worry about them right now as something that you'll get to later. Things in the top right, high certainty that the condition itself will actually be met and they're important. Those are good tasks to outsource or good conditions and actions to outsource to capable lieutenants that can focus on this. But for those in the red and yellow box, what we like to do is group them together. So I like to see if there are thematic drivers that are demonstrating specific types of problems, say a competitor problem, which is really a observe and then act. There's issues around customers, or there's something around technical. But what we like to do is thematically try to find what are the most essential elements. There's normally 2 or 3 that get grouped together, and then we develop an action plan around that. And Lexi, if you can go to the next slide. That's where you take it and actualize it. So the idea is you identify where those pieces are thematically at, and then you develop a specific action plan around it. Now, action planning can be quite detailed and should be ultimately down to what the sub-actions are to manifest that condition, as well as what is necessary, who's going to do it, what the budget and timing are associated with it. But as you track this over time, you can see the arrows as they move up or they're flat. It demonstrates where you're actually creating success and either reducing the risk or actually clearing those conditions so that you can move on to the next conditions. And that's really, I think, the power, the second piece that's what's so powerful about our approach. So the first piece is really this idea of understanding everyone's assumptions. The second piece, though, is about converting strategy into action. And that's where this really comes to life, because now you're iterating over time to make sure that your actions are generating success along the strategy line that you're trying to achieve. If it's not, it allows you to revisit to determine why. There might be new information, there might have been a poor approach, but that's the important piece here, is to be able to revisit this over time. So ultimately, I know I covered this quickly, that's how SMA likes to think about strategy, capture, win, enterprise, driving strategy through action.